Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into some fascinating source material. It's excerpts from Christopher Hitchens's Letters to a Young Contrarian.
Yeah, this isn't just a standard book. You should think of it more like a series of, well, very personal letters. They're addressed to this young correspondent, just called X, who basically asked Hitchens for advice on living a radical life, a contrarian life.
So our mission here is to unpack these letters. We want to pull out the sharpest points, the practical advice maybe, and definitely the historical examples he uses to show what it actually means to think for yourself and, well, speak up.
Right. Even when it's tough. It's kind of a shortcut maybe to understanding the challenges, but also the rewards of standing apart, all seen through Hitchens's very particular lens. We'll explore, what he means by dissent, why he thinks it matters so much.
The obstacles you'll face, definitely.
Definitely. And maybe how you sustain that kind of stance, for the long haul.
Okay, so let's get into it. This whole idea, what is a contrarian or maybe dissident or radical in the way Hitchens discusses it here? But first, maybe we'll just set the scene a bit. So Hitchens gets this request right. Basically, how should someone young, maybe restless, live if they want to challenge things, maybe change the world, or even just refuse to, live a lie?
Exactly. And the source material, it's framed as these letters. It's directly inspired by Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, so it has that very personal, direct feel.
And he kicks off with a bit of self-awareness, almost humility. He quotes Byron, kind of wondering he's even the right person to give this kind of advice based on his own life.
Yeah, and that's actually really important context. He talks early on about how discouraging it can be to be misrepresented in public. He lists all these figures he critiqued: Mother Teresa, Princess Diana, Clinton, Milosevic, Kissinger.
Quite a list.
Right. And he points out how his arguments were often just simplified or twisted, used against him. He even mentions, almost wryly, testifying against Mother Teresa's sainthood for the Vatican, and finding their procedures, ironically, more scrupulous than some secular critics. So this personal history, it really grounds the whole thing in the reality of the pushback you're likely to get if you take an unpopular stance.
That personal side does make it feel less theoretical. It shows what kind of, well, fight he's actually talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does he call this stance? He seems to explore a few different words.
He really digs into the language here. Dissident, for instance. He says it's a noble title, sure, but it's something that has to be earned, usually through real sacrifice, like opposing an actual authoritarian regime. It's not really something you can just, claim for yourself if you live in a free society.
Right. Makes sense. Then there's radical. He seems warm towards that one.
Yeah, he finds it useful, honorable even, though he does add it comes with health warnings. He also runs through other terms like maverick, rebel, gadfly. But he suggests these can sometimes sound a bit condescending, like society is just tolerating some harmless oddball.
As opposed to the terms used when they don't see you as harmless.
Exactly. Then you get things like fanatic, troublemaker, misfit, malcontent. Those are the labels meant to, shut you down, isolate you.
But he brings up free thinker as being, well, superior in some ways. Why is that?
Because it focuses on how you think independently, based on reason, not what you end up thinking. It's about the process, the intellectual honesty, not the specific belief itself.
Interesting point he makes, too, about the word intellectual itself.
Yeah.
That it originally started as an insult during the Dreyfus affair in France.
Yeah, used against Dreyfus's defenders, implying they were somehow diseased or disloyal. Words get turned into weapons pretty fast.
They do. And he also notes how words like satirical or ironic can get kind of watered down, especially in entertainment, reduced to just cynical jokes, losing their critical bite.
But the main takeaway, the core idea he pulls from this, is pretty sobering. He says, basically, don't expect the world to welcome dissent. Most people, understandably, want approval. They want security. They want to fit in. Nothing inherently wrong with that.
But there's always a but.
But, he argues, humanity owes a huge debt to the ones who don't fit in, who feel apart, who won't seek that easy approval. And here's the kicker. Don't expect any thanks for it. This life, the life of opposition, it's going to be difficult. That's just baked in. And to really show this, Hitchens dives into some powerful historical examples, people who really lived this idea of standing apart. Emile Zola and the Dreyfus affair in France is probably the central case study he uses.
Zola, right. Why him specifically? What makes him the pattern here?
Well, Zola, the famous novelist, he wasn't really an activist at first. He got pulled in because of this clear injustice. Alfred Dreyfus, this Jewish army officer, framed for treason. Zola basically used his skills, his journalistic forensic skills, to dig up the facts, but finding the facts wasn't actually the hardest part.
Ah, the hard part was getting people to listen or accept them.
Exactly. Powerful groups, the army, the church, the nationalists, they did not want those facts out. Their whole argument was basically reasons of state, social order. That stuff was more important than justice for one person, especially a Jewish outsider. The people defending Dreyfus, the Dreyfusards, they were called traitors, unpatriotic.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
It is, and it brings up that stark old Roman saying, fiat justitia ruat caelum, do justice though the skies fall. Hitchens uses this to show how that collective desire for just a quiet life, avoiding any big disruption, it often leads us to sacrifice truth, sacrifice the individual for what feels like order. Zola saw it wasn't just about Dreyfus, it was an attack on reason itself. So he broadened his attack.
Right, he went after clericalism, racial hatred, militarism.
The sort of fetishization of the nation state, all of it.
And he didn't just write essays. He wrote these really explosive public letters, right, to the president, but also to the French people, the youth, warning them about anti-Semitism, calling it idiotic poison, warning about a somber public opinion that just crushes truth.
Yeah, and he was really specific. He criticized how people adored the strong men, the generals, the fancy uniforms, rather than the actual army serving the Republic. And he really went after the church, seeing it as actively fanning the flames of anti-Semitism to regain power.
That fierce anger, that saive indignatio, it led to the famous JQ's letter, accusing specific people, a whole syndicate really, of framing an innocent man or protecting the guilty. The source makes a sharp point here. Authorities like the term miscarriage of justice.
Right, sounds accidental.
Yeah, but Hitchens says no. Deliberately framing the innocent while letting the guilty go free. That's not a miscarriage, that's an abortion of justice. It's deliberate, intentional.
And the source argues this whole affair was like a dark preview of the worst parts of the 20th century. Verdun, Vichy. Zola didn't just observe from afar. He demanded his own day in the dock for what he believed. He put himself on the line.
That kind of stand obviously takes immense courage. The source talks about that too.
Yeah, courage is presented as like the fundamental virtue, the one that makes all the others even possible. Hitchens contrasts Galileo, who, recanted under threat from the church, with Zola, whose bravery was for someone else, an outsider. The source even mentions the possibility that Zola might have been murdered for it. It underlines the real risks involved.
And there's another example, Ron Ridenour and the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. That highlights a different kind of courage, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The courage to face the awful truth that your own side, your own team is doing something terrible. The pressure in those situations to just be a team player, to not stab your comrades in the back or give ammunition to the enemy, it's huge.
And Ridenour's character comes through in that earlier story, too, standing up to fellow soldiers, planning to assault a black soldier, saying, you have to come through me.
Yeah.
That's individual will against the mob.
Right. Pure individual determination.
It reminds me of that quote Hitchens digs up from Bertrand Russell's grandmother's Bible, of all places. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. So simple, but powerful.
Totally. And these examples, they aren't just history lessons. Hitchens is arguing that recognizing this tendency in yourself, this instinct to push back against arbitrary authority or groupthink, that little thrill you get from using your own mind freely, that's important. It might not just be something you do sometimes, it might be part of who you are.
Okay, so living this as if life, this life of dissent, it means you're constantly hitting obstacles.
Yeah, the source definitely doesn't sugarcoat that. The odds, favoring stupidity, superstition, unchecked power, they can feel overwhelming. But Hitchens also emphasizes this ineradicable instinct, as he calls it, to see beyond or through these tyrannical conditions. Like Freud said, the voice of reason. It's small, but it's persistent.
It's about, the art of challenging what is appealing. That quote from Elaine. People get really attached to their illusions, their prejudices, whether it's religion, patriotism, whatever. Allegiance is just a really strong force.
True, but Karl Popper's point about arguments is interesting here. Maybe you don't always convert your opponent directly, but just through the process of arguing, of challenging ideas, things shift. Positions get tweaked, the whole landscape changes a bit, even if minds don't flip overnight.
And this connects to a whole line of thinkers Hitchens brings in, right? Orwell saying you have to tell people what they don't want to hear.
Mill saying you must hear out even the one dissenter. Marx demanding doubt about everything. The omnibus disputandum.
Luxemburg on freedom, for those who think differently. Milton on truth, needing the test of falsehood. Frederick Douglass saying there's no justice without struggle. Yeah, they all point towards truth being something active, something you fight for, not just receive.
And the source really turns this back on you, the listener.
Yeah.
Uses that Latin phrase, de te fabula narratur, this story. It's about you. If you're going to challenge others, you've got to challenge yourself first. The educator needs educating, constantly.
He quotes Dr. Israel Shahak approvingly for seeing encouraging signs of polarization. That sounds counterintuitive.
Well, Shahak's point, as presented, is that only open conflict between ideas actually brings clarity. If you're always trying to find some painless middle ground, some easy consensus, you end up with just mindlessness. You avoid the necessary clash.
Okay. Then the source starts picking apart the common arguments used against dissent, like platitudes about healing or unity.
Right. Which automatically make division sound like the bad thing, implying disagreement itself is the problem, rather than, say, injustice.
And other ways to shut down thinking. Things like cults, maybe certain medications or types of Eastern spirituality use justice therapy. Anything that encourages just passivity.
Yeah, or just empty platitudes repeated as if they're deep wisdom. Anything to dull the critical edge.
Plus the direct challenges. What difference will it make anyway? Hitchens pushes back hard on that. Cosmic absurdity is no excuse for accepting injustice right here, right now.
Yeah.
Or who are you to judge? Who asked you? Is this really the right time?
And the big one, you're just giving ammunition to the enemy. Hitchens uses Orwell again here, that essay Through a Glass Rosalie. Orwell warned against suppressing uncomfortable facts, even if they might seem to help your opponent short term. The long-term cost of dishonesty is always worse. He even throws in that Blake quote.
The one about truth told with bad intent.
Yeah, a truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies you can invent. Powerful stuff.
He also goes after arguments like the principle of the wedge or the dangerous precedent. Basically, arguments against doing the right thing now because of some imagined bad consequence down the road.
Exactly. He sees them as just excuses for inaction, prioritizing abstract caution over concrete justice.
And he warns you, don't use these kinds of arguments yourself. Even seemingly personal reasons like life is short or trying to see things from an eternal perspective can become ways to justify compromise or just checking out.
There's that really telling story from Cuba in 1968. Hitchens just asks these basic questions to an official. Can you satirize the leader? Can people travel freely? Publish freely?
Simple questions.
You'd think so. But he gets called a counter-revolutionary. It shows how quickly the completely obvious stuff becomes forbidden territory when power feels threatened.
It connects to the Emperor's New Clothes story, doesn't it? Seeing the obvious but the huge social pressure not to say anything. Like kids asking why. They haven't learned to self-censor yet.
Exactly. And finally, he points out how dangerous our own adaptability can be. We can get used to almost anything, even existential threats like nuclear weapons. We live, he argues, as if this massive salient fact about our world just isn't true. He admits his own struggle with this, living under governments with that power, but insists on resisting the urge to grant them full legitimacy.
So the bottom line here is, you have to constantly question the obvious, the given, the consensus, the omnius dubitandum. Everything must be doubted. Okay, so if you're facing all these obstacles, all this pressure, how do you actually keep going, especially when things seem quiet, when nothing seems to be changing?
Well, Hitchens suggests that during those quieter times, those stalemate periods, the key strategy is to survive by living as if.
Living as if. What does that mean in practice?
The main example he uses is Václav Havel in communist Czechoslovakia. His idea in The Power of the Powerless. Havel argued that if you just choose to live as if you were already free, as if lying wasn't mandatory, as if the government actually had to follow the human rights treaties it signed just by living that literal truth, you expose how ridiculous and illegitimate the system demanding your complicity really is. You make the state look stupid.
Ah, right. Like E.P. Thompson's idea too. Living as if a free Europe already existed. That helped keep dissident movements going, didn't it?
Precisely. And Hitchens connects this to those people power moments in 1989, where whole populations brought down regimes partly by just acting as if, using sarcasm, taking sham elections literally, behaving as if their votes mattered.
He uses other examples too, like Oscar Wilde.
Yeah, Wilde living as if Victorian moral hypocrisy wasn't the dominant force. Rosa Parks acting as if a black woman could sit anywhere on the bus. Solzhenitsyn writing history as if an individual scholar in the USSR could do independent research and publish it. It's about embodying the truth you believe in, often in a very literal way, which itself becomes a kind of ironic statement against the prevailing lie. And the source really encourages you, the listener, to try and cultivate this attitude in your own life, to behave as if you don't actually have to put up with the everyday instances of bullying or bigotry or sloppy arguments or petty power plays or the pressure to just nod along with things you know are false. Act as if they don't need to be tolerated.
Hitchens also gets into the inner life of a contrarian, especially around faith, reason, skepticism.
He does. He looks at courage that comes from religious faith, citing Jefferson trembling for his country, knowing God is just. But Hitchens himself is, well, deeply skeptical. He argues that courage rooted in faith can often lead down a bad path, intellectually or morally. Why? Because it tempts you into thinking God's on your side, or that things don't need proof because faith supplies the answer.
He's pretty critical of religion's structure, too, isn't he? Calling it quiet and irrational authoritarianism.
Yeah, he points to ideas like humans being created sick, commanded to be well, or the church offering salvation you didn't ask for and threatening punishment if you refuse. He argues that's almost worse than a big brother state because it claims authority over your very soul, your nature.
But he acknowledges heroic believers like William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist.
He does acknowledge them, yes. But he argues their positive actions happen despite their religious beliefs, not because of them. He feels that worldview can ultimately be discarded. He's particularly critical of what he calls unreflective belief systems, whether religious like Islam or political like communism, because he thinks their basic thought patterns contain the seeds of future oppression.
He tackles that famous G.K. Chesterton line, too. If people cease to believe in God, they do not believe in nothing but in anything. What's Hitchens' comeback?
His counter is pretty sharp. He says, well, the original act of believing in God already shows you're willing to believe in nothing, that is, things with no evidence in anything. It involves accepting huge claims without proof from the start.
So he sees religion partly as a tool for control, contrasting individual skeptical pride with the idea of the flock.
Exactly, that sickly form of collectivism, he calls it. He makes that point, too, that solidarity isn't always reality. You know, Dunn's famous line, the bell tolls for thee. Hitchens implies, well, maybe sometimes it doesn't. You have to think for yourself.
He lines up with Freud, seeing religious superstition as part of humanity's childhood, and argues secular humanism is morally superior.
Yes, because it's free from what he sees as opportunistic wishful thinking about divine favor or an afterlife.
Yeah.
And his main argument is for permanent engagement. You constantly have to challenge those who claim to have absolute truth, who claim to possess what cannot be possessed. He echoes Marx here. The criticism of religion is the premise of all criticism. You've got to start by questioning the most fundamental, unquestioned assumptions.
He accepts science helps, but won't fully replace religion. The argument from design keeps coming back.
Right. And in a moment of real honesty, Hitchens admits he doesn't have a neat answer for the ultimate point of his own skepticism. And he says that very lack of an easy answer makes him distrust anyone who claims they do have all the answers.
Okay, shifting outwards again. How do you deal with society, with public opinion, especially when you get called an elitist?
Right, the elitist charge. Hitchens basically says it's meant to hurt, but he shrugs it off. He flips it, arguing that the history of dissent shows truth-tellers are almost always initially mocked or dismissed by the crowd, by public opinion. He uses the example of the few who opposed World War I at the beginning.
So, saving ideas from the crowd, like Socrates, Homer, evolution, things suppressed by piety or censorship.
Exactly. Piety, in this view, often shuts down the open mind, the open book, and he's really scathing about modern public opinion, especially as reflected in polls. He calls it smoothly ventriloquized. He doubts the alarming exactness of poll numbers, pointing to things like loaded questions or skewed samples.
And this is a crucial point from the source test. Polls aren't just measuring opinion, they're often paid for by powerful groups, kind of like market research. The real aim, he suggests, isn't just to reflect opinion, but to shape it. Polls influence future polls. He tells that funny story about reading poll results on Clinton and thinking, I never seem to meet anyone who actually thinks this.
Right. He hates the tendency to aim for the lowest common denominator in public debate. And he argues it takes much more guts to actually stand up to a passionate mob than it does to just make fun of some unpopular authority figure.
He brings in quotes, supporting the power of the individual with the truth. Friedman, Kropotkin.
Yeah, Friedman saying, one man plus a correct opinion outvotes a majority. Kropotkin saying, if only one person has the truth, that's enough. Science often works like that too, right? One person or a small group sees something new first.
He even argues figures sometimes called elitist, like Machiavelli or Houdini, actually help demystify things, bringing hidden knowledge out into the open.
Right. And he uses that Marx quote about criticism plucking the imaginary flowers from the chain so people can see the chain itself and reach for the living flower. The point being, people might be entitled to their illusions, maybe, but they're not entitled to force them on others or demand respect for them.
So if someone challenges you, how dare you intervene? The counter is,
how dare you not intervene? You need the confidence to say what you believe is true. Doing nothing is still a choice. And yeah, expect pushback if you take a stand.
okay, then there's identity politics. The source acknowledges its roots in feminism. The personal is political, but then gets very critical, calls it a truly bad idea.
Yeah, he argues it dangerously shifts the focus. Instead of looking at what people think or do their actions, their arguments, it focuses on their feelings and their identity, who they were. He worries this leads to a kind of narcissism of the small difference, with groups just splintering and focusing inwards. And he argues it can turn reactionary very quickly, using the Clarence Thomas hearings as an example where identity seemed to trump qualifications or actions.
His advice is pretty blunt then.
It's very blunt. Essentially, have nothing to do with identity politics.
What about humor? Irony? Are they weapons in this fight or just, I don't know, coping mechanisms?
It's complicated. The source points out laughter isn't always good. Mobs laugh. Canned laughter exists. But yes, humor is also a crucial defense against oppressive power, or just against, fate. Think of all the jokes told under dictatorships.
Milan Kundera's novel, The Joke, gets into that, and Mila's calling irony the glory of slaves, a way to feel intellectually superior when you have no real power.
Exactly. The literal-minded authority figure often just doesn't get irony. He uses that old Voltaire joke about calculating how many true crosses must exist based on all the supposed fragments churches claim to have. But the tension from a radical viewpoint is humor a real tool for change, or just comfort food that doesn't actually challenge power? Nietzsche called a joke an epitaph on a feeling assigned something's over.
Hitchens puts himself in the pro-wit radical faction, though, citing Oscar Wilde.
He does. But then he brings in Sartre's paradox. The difference between the rebel, who maybe secretly needs this system to rebel against, and the revolutionary, who genuinely wants to overthrow it and has to be deadly serious. Revolution isn't funny. He notes satire can even become impossible when reality outdoes it, like Tom Lehrer quitting satire after Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize.
So effective humor in this context needs to be sharp, fearless.
Pointed, witty, fearless, yeah. Simple caricature might be easily absorbed or tolerated. But the more biting forms, ironic, maybe even obscene humor, those have revolutionary potential. He mentions caricatures like Damier actually going to jail.
And his rule of thumb.
If you're worried you've gone too far, you probably haven't. And if absolutely everyone laughs, you've probably failed to make a real point. Irony especially is hard to pin down, hard to repress. It plays with unintended consequences. It mocks anyone claiming history is neatly on their side.
But the final thought on humor is a bit sobering.
Yeah. For the really serious causes, you might just have to be prepared to be, boring sometimes. The truth doesn't always come with a punchline.
Right. That makes sense. It sounds like this life demands incredible persistence. And during those long periods of tedium punctuated by brief moments of terror, like his warfare analogy.
Exactly. Keeping going, avoiding just falling into routine is key. He says, don't worry if people call you a monomaniac. That's usually an insult from people who are too easy on themselves.
So there's the art of breaking silence, but also the science of making silence bearable. Like working for prisoners, lots of hideous visits, letters, meetings. The big breakthrough, the Dreyfus moment, is rare.
And he uses the Bosnian War in the 90s as a major detailed case study here. For him, it was the shocking return of, concentration camps, mass murder right there in Europe. And what was chilling was that it wasn't hidden. It was happening in daylight, being filmed.
Unlike earlier genocides he mentions, like the Armenian or Jewish ones, which were often carried out undercover. He contrasts Bosnia's multiculturalism, especially Sarajevo, with the aggressive ethnic nationalism of Serbia and Croatia. He calls the assault a planned thing by Tudjman and Milosevic, like a mini Hitler-Stalin pact, aimed at grabbing land, not keeping the people. Ethnic cleansing.
Right. A war of massacre, using terms like cleansing openly, destroying mosques and libraries even during supposed ceasefires. Serbian and Croatian forces often fought under religious flags, while the Bosnians, often labeled just the Muslims, were frequently fighting simply as Bosnians, trying to preserve a multi-ethnic society.
And this leads to a core argument in the source. Letting race and state become the same thing is disastrous, suicidal even for civilization. But Bosnia asked for help, or at least the right to defend itself, and got hit with an arms embargo instead.
Yeah, a deeply hypocritical arms embargo in his view. Hitchens talks about his own decision to go to Sarajevo, even though it felt maybe a bit absurd given his past work, but it became a moment of pride for him. He saw people at their absolute best and worst. And he stresses the importance of the Bosnians largely refusing to reply to ethnic hatred in kind. He gives examples of Serbs and Muslims still working together under siege, like at the newspaper Oslobođenje.
And even opposition figures in Serbia and Croatia saw defending Bosnia as crucial for fighting nationalism back home.
Yes, they understood the connection. The source is incredibly critical of the widespread indifference, the appeasement from Western powers, the US, Russia, even parts of the left. He sees the Srebrenica massacre as the horrific result of all that evasion and hypocrisy. He calls defending Bosnia a fundamental civilization question, something you sometimes have to be pompous and boring about to get the point across.
And a key lesson he draws from Bosnia is about allies. Don't be too fussy about who you find yourself standing alongside in a cause.
Right, you'll find all sorts of people. You can disagree on other things. Maybe those disagreements even move to a higher level through the shared struggle. Judging potential allies too harshly, engaging in what he calls platonic discrimination, often just leaves you isolated and ineffective. Those who judge company too much are often in bad company themselves. For Hitchens, Bosnia brought together different generations of dissenters. It highlighted what he saw as the next big fight, the struggle for universal human rights, for the globalization of justice.
He quotes William Morris there, about men fighting and losing, and others having to fight again for the same thing under a different name.
Yeah. It's a reminder of the long, dialectical, often ironic nature of these struggles. They don't end neatly. And he pushes back against Robert Conquest's idea that it's always idealists and utopians who cause the worst problems. Hitchens argues, no, look at history. The biggest crimes often come from clinging to traditional garbage nation, tribe, faith, order. Utopians become tyrants, he thinks, mostly by copying the methods of the old oppressors. Discontent is permanent. Even the Soviets had psychosurgeons treating dissent as a reformist delusion.
So the ultimate goal of a high ambition is really tough then.
Extremely. To combine, as he puts it, maximum impatience with injustice and irrationality, maximum skepticism towards power and dogma, with maximum ironic self-criticism. It means constantly learning from history, not just name-dropping it.
And finally, the source comes back to the human side of it all. The flaws of people involved, but also the dignity of ordinary individuals.
Yeah, Hitchens talks about the sheer thrill of meeting people who were once political prisoners and had then become leaders, seeing that transformation.
But he's realistic too. He points out that vigilance is always needed. Some of those same former dissidents later compromised their principles. He gives examples figures in Latin America, Mbeki on AIDS, Mandela regarding Moy, Solzhenitsyn's later pronouncements, Havel on the Roma. The fight doesn't just stop when one battle is won.
But interestingly, he finds kind of comfort in the flaws of heroes like Martin Luther King Jr., mentioning the plagiarism, the infidelity. His point isn't to tear them down, but to say, look, incredible things are achieved by fallible human beings, by mammals. That means potentially anyone could contribute something significant.
He contrasts this with modern celebrity culture, focusing on celebs or royalty as role models. He argues their lives, based on fame or privilege, often can't really be emulated in a meaningful way by ordinary people trying to do good.
And he tells that powerful story from Peter Schneider about ordinary Berliners who hid Jews during the Nazi era. It wasn't grand heroism, just quiet, low-level bravery. But it completely destroyed the alibi of millions who claimed later there was nothing we could do.
The moral is pretty clear. Everyone can do something. The dissenter isn't some kind of plaster saint. Acknowledging fallibility makes the example more real, more achievable.
He uses Catch-22, Yossarian, and Major Danby to illustrate that people who genuinely think for themselves will likely always be a minority. Humans naturally seek reassurance, belonging, which creates a paradox. Dissenters are independent, yes, but they're often motivated by a deep concern for others, for justice.
He mentions a lost generation who dissented within the left or against it, relying purely on conscience against the group pressure. He warns against getting lost in we or us rhetoric if it just becomes tribalism, seeking safety in numbers, individuals make up the masses. Stick with your inner Yossarian, basically.
He looks at the word radical, again, its root meaning, uses Thomas Paine as someone who really went to the roots, challenging monarchy, religion, and later even revolutionary excess in big government. Even Edmund Burke, a Tory, could be radical in advocating for oppressed groups. Radicalism isn't confined to one camp.
And Adam Mitnick's key insight. The fundamental question is whether the citizen is seen as the property of the state. That connects back to Paine, and it's incredibly relevant in the nuclear age. Asking that question leads to truly radical places.
So the source ends on this note about humanity. Yes, stupidity and cruelty are everywhere. But so are humanism, the instinct for justice, for liberty. People know deep down when they're being lied to. They see absurdity in rulers. They don't actually love being chained. He found, often surprisingly, that sane, decent people were there all along in many fights. The crucial tool is the mind, not the gut. People stand up, ultimately, out of dignity.
And that final little anecdote about Rakia, the aid worker in Bosnia, refusing to engage in the ethnic conflict by saying her group took no position on tribal rivalries in Belgium.
Devastatingly simple, isn't it? Just highlights the sheer arbitrariness of it all.
Wow. We've really gone deep into these letters today, explored that whole challenge of living a contrarian life, seen it grounded in history, looked at the obstacles, the strategies, the very human side of it all.
Yeah, from just defining the terms to facing down bad arguments. That idea of living as if, dealing with faith and doubt, using irony, getting through the boring bits, and recognizing the power of flawed heroes. It's a lot. A powerful guide to thinking for yourself.
It really is a reminder that even though the pressure to conform is huge, that instinct to question, to resist injustice, to just assert your own dignity, it's still there, thankfully.
And that core tension Hitchens lays out, that high ambition. To mix that impatience and skepticism with real ironic self-awareness, it's definitely not easy.
So here's a final thought for you to take away. If the hardest thing to see is often right under your nose, and there's all this social pressure not to notice the obvious, what obvious truth might you be overlooking or maybe feeling pressured to ignore in your own life right now?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.